Lost Generation. Back with my merry band of fowlers. I want to do a whole series of videos. And I think we have to go at the underlying preconceptions first, go for the roots, and work our way up. And this is just going to be a hopefully brief video on what ancient war could be like and what the attitudes of the people were like towards one another and the things they would do to one another. Because war and slavery, and this comment gets me in trouble with a lot of people. People do not like to hear this simple truth about human history. But warfare and slavery are pretty much part and parcel to the human story for much of our history. And attitudes have changed to the modern day. So people try to take these modern ideas, these modern concepts of war, and their emotions based on various factors, and try to look at history through that lens. And when you do that, you can't look at history objectively. So strike away your emotional attachment, your preconceived notions. I'm just going to give you a few examples. These aren't, in depth. They're not all well-researched points or anything like that. There's just a few things that I've learned in the past that I'm going back to find a little bit of material to present to you on. I did all my history study throughout my life, and some of it was with college lectures, some of it was with college textbooks, some of it was documentaries, audio books. I've pretty much listened to all the ancient sources, and anything that's not copyrighted that I could get on audiobook I listen to. So a lot of different sources where I got my historical overview knowledge from. And these are just a few things off the top of my head that I could think of right now to just pull some information up for you. Let's jump in. Like the onset of a terrible hurricane, I overwhelmed Elam in its entirety. I cut off the head of Tumen, their king, the haughty one, who plotted evil. Countless of his warriors I slew. Alive, with my hands I seized his fighters. With their corpses I filled the plain about Susa, as with Baltu and Ashagu. Their blood I let run down the Ule. Its water I dyed red like wool. Ashurbanipal of the Assyrian. Okay, for another example that we're going to do here, we're going to talk about the sack of Thebes by Alexander the Great. This is important to consider because this is Macedonian on Greek, or in the Macedonian viewpoint, Greek on Greek. So it was in 335 BC, I believe. And Alexander went north to deal with the Thracian tribes, and since he was relatively untested, the Greeks, they revolted, and one of the city-states that was really leading this was Thebes. So Alexander turned around, went back down into Greece, and basically subdued a lot of these revolting city-states. But he set out to make a lesson, particularly of Thebes. And what happened when he took Thebes was he razed the city to the ground except for the temples and a single poet's house. It's a pretty famous story from history. But what he did to the people is what you should consider. Allegedly, he killed about 6,000 citizens of the city-state. And then with the remaining 30,000, he sold them all, every single one of them, into slavery. And that's really the only city he made that kind of example out of. But that just goes to show you the overwhelming power that ancient rulers had, the license they had, and the potential brutality of ancient warfare. Let's look at some other examples. Alright, another example I'd like to look at would be the famous Battle of Cannae between Hannibal and the Romans. And Hannibal actually had a long string of victories during this campaign which lasted quite a prolonged time as he was marching around Italy, gaining victory after victory. And Cannae is extremely famous because it was a near total defeat of a very large Roman army. And the numbers are disputed, but the traditional number of dead for the Romans is somewhere around 80,000, which is the majority of their army, in a single day, cut down by spear and sword. So when you think of these ancient techniques of warfare, consider in a single battlefield over 80,000 men being slain by hand. But the most shocking statistic is in 3 campaign seasons, Rome lost 1/5 of its entire male population, over 17 years old. Just absolutely devastating. And it reminds me of the war in Paraguay in a later time date, which maybe we'll touch on later, where the majority of the males in Paraguay ended up dying in that conflict. Absolutely devastating and shocking, but doesn't really fit our time period, so we're not going to talk about it. Let me get into some other examples. When you need shocking examples of ancient to medieval warfare, look to none other than the steppe peoples. We're talking about the Huns, the Mongols, and other various khanates that were formed from those groups. You can even go back to the Sarmatians, which predated the Huns. But a really good example of what warfare could be like in these times was the sack of Baghdad by Hulagu Khan. Hopefully I get the pronunciation right there. Essentially what happened in this sack was the caliph kind of stood up to the Khanate, the Ilkhanate. And Hulagu Khan, he said, I'm going to take Baghdad. And he was entirely successful in doing so. And it goes down in history as one of the most catastrophic sackings of a city. It's right up there with the end of Carthage, when the Romans completely extirpated their capital. So the Khanate took Baghdad, and for 10 days completely subjugated the population. They sold them into slavery or just straight up executed them summarily right there on the streets or where they found them. And of course, there's a lot of artistic license with descriptions, but it is said that the river Tigris ran red. After they did this, they systematically tore the city apart. Its mosques, palaces, markets. I believe there was a library in Baghdad as well. They were all completely destroyed. I mean, absolute devastation. And that's how the Huns, the Sarmatians, the Mongols pretty much conducted their affairs on a regular basis for a long period of time. The Sarmatians were around in Greek times. So the Huns were around in Roman times, and the Mongols are still around today, but they were doing a lot of their rampaging in the 12, 13, 1400s time frame. But it's a really good example if you want to look into it more on the sheer horror that was inflicted on Baghdad. Let's find a couple more examples for you real quick. The Sultan's army entered into the area of impalements, which was 17 stadies long and 7 stadies wide. There were large stakes thereon which, as it was said, about 20,000 men, women, and children had been spitted. Quite a sight for the Turks and the Sultan himself. The Sultan was seized with amazement and said that it was not possible to deprive of his country a man who had done such great deeds, who had such a diabolical understanding of how to govern his realm and its people. And he said that a man who had done such things was worth much. The rest of the Turks were dumbfounded when they saw the multitude of men on stakes. There were infants, too, attached to their mothers on the stakes, and birds had made their nests in their entrails. Leonikos Chalkokondyles, the histories. And that is, of course, referring to the mass impalement that Vlad Dracul, Vlad the Impaler Tepes, had inflicted on Targo Vishta in his Scorched Earth campaign before the arrival of the Sultan Mehmed of the Ottoman Empire. Alright, got another example for you. This one's going to be quick, just to get a little diversity into it. We're going to look at an African empire that doesn't really get a lot of attention when people talk about history, and that is the Songhai Empire. And we're going to read a short account of what happened when Emperor Sani Ali marched into Timbuktu. Suni Ali entered Timbuktu, committed gross iniquity, burned and destroyed the town, and brutally tortured many people there. When Akilu heard of the coming of Sani Ali, he brought 1,000 camels to carry the Fukaha of Sankor and went with them to Walata. The godless tyrant was engaged in slaughtering those who remained in Timbuktu and humiliated them. Alright, for one quick last example, I'm going to just read, because I don't have any source material here, and I don't really have an excellent mastery at Eastern history, but I'm just going to read a couple quick quotes off of Wikipedia for you, and it's about the Warring States period in China. In 269 BC, Fan Shui became chief advisor to Qin. He advocated authoritarian reforms, irrevocable expansion, and an alliance with distant states to attack nearby states. His maxim was, quote, attack not only the territory, but also the people, enunciating a policy of mass slaughter that became increasingly frequent. Quote, Wikipedia, when Zhao Kuo left his fortifications, Bai Qi used a Kenne maneuver, falling back in the center and surrounding the Zhao army from the sides. After being surrounded for 46 days, the starving Zhao troops surrendered in September 260 BC. It is said that Bai Qi had all the prisoners killed and that Zhao lost 400,000 men. So there is a slaughter of an entire surrendered army, a policy of mass slaughter attacking the people. And if you think that these are all just ancient concepts as well, you're sadly mistaken. They continue up to the modern day. We like to try to dress things up as modern war, limited war, restricted war, kinetic military actions. But the right of conquest actually existed up until World War II, and it still honestly really does. It's just dressed up with different names and euphemisms. It's not for governments to gain territory necessarily, but wars of conquest still do occur. And we see that with these so-called nation building and stuff like that. It's not what you think it is. It's definitely not what you think it is. In World War II, of course, we saw things like the firebombing of Dresden, the siege of Buda and Pest, which was absolutely insane, the Battle of Stalingrad, a lot of horrific things. But anyways, this video is not about that. I just hope that this gets you a little bit more in tune with what older forms of warfare were like and what older values towards warfare and conquest were like. We have to stop trying to attribute modern viewpoints and emotions to history if we want to see it objectively.